conceived as professional sociologists with no value commitment is nonetheless to serve the public in some way. Better knowledge, perhaps better policy. We don't actually do any of this. And what I'm trying to suggest is very problematic because the knowledge of the world as we see it is given not by professional social scientists, but by journalists by and large. So you read Thomas Friedman, who says the world is flat. You read Malcolm Gladwell, talks about Blink, whatever. You read Robert Kagan on wars and ethnicity. But we don't turn to sociologists or other social scientists to get knowledge of the present, meaning the way the world is now, the way the world has come to be. And this is one of the fundamental, I think, problems facing the social science today. But getting back to a more tractable topic, discipline has been ill-equipped, I want to suggest, to deal with social reality because the main impulse has been generalizing. It's to create nomothetic or abstract knowledge, generalizations. And by and large, the will to generalize has served us very poorly in making sense of the world. And this is true for a number of reasons. One, of course, is that the world isn't neatly divided into different areas. If you go into the streets, you know that the world, individuals, groups, or tiny society can be neatly divided into politics, economics, and society. They're all messed up. It's all mixed up. And more disturbingly, Taiwan is not an island, at least in sociological or social scientific sense. You get many products imported as much as you export. There are people coming and going. And we know, or you know now, that it's not all that homogeneous. There was a kind of myth that you were all same, but it's obviously not true. So a lot of the will to generalize has served us poorly in making sense of the social reality. The second and even more disturbing is the simple fact that the world is constantly changing. One of the reasons that it's impossible to read great sociological articles from 50 years ago, or even 20 years ago today, is that the world has changed so much that what they say make almost no sense. And I can give you many, many different examples. But in the US, for example, it's almost impossible to read, if you're studying race or ethnicity, articles written 20 or 30 years before. Why? Well, they sound just racist. Even though they were value-neutral scientists, to our sensibilities, they just sound racist, just as much as if you read gender, family articles from 30, 40 years ago, they just sound sexist. They meant to be scientifically neutral, but we can't do it. Why is that? Well, it's because we live in a different world. And finally, the world, as I briefly mentioned, is very idiographic, meaning that it's very different. The texture, the tangible texture of everyday life, it's so different. So it doesn't take long for an American, for example, to come to Taiwan and notice that it seems very different. Even though, of course, Taipei today is so much similar, so much more accessible to an American. When I first came to Taipei 25 years ago, it was very different. It's hard to get coffee, for example. I have Starbucks every time you turn around. I mean, that's a very trivial example, but it's nonetheless the case that as much as we like to believe in these sociological abstractions and theories, every time we move even a bit, we come to the inevitable reality of differences. Differences not just across cultures, but also among individuals. One of my teachers was a very well-known sociologist at the time, named David Riesman. David Riesman was famous enough so that he was on the cover of Time magazine, when being on the cover of Time magazine was a great distinction. It was reserved for presidents and Nobel Prize winners and so on. Well, David Riesman was a very famous sociologist because he wrote a book called The Lonely Crowd, a study of American society. But he also actually wrote a book on Japan because he spent some time in Japan, 4 months, and wrote a 600-page book called Conversation in Japan. What's very disturbing about this book is it's written in the form kind of a diary. About 150 pages in, David Riesman writes, after being in Japan for 2 months, I am finally beginning to be able to tell Japanese people apart. Meaning that until then, they looked all like Orientals. So you couldn't tell them apart. It's hard to do sociology if they all look the same. Or maybe it's easy to do sociology if they all look the same. But it's very interesting that a famous sociologist who couldn't tell Japanese people apart from each other and who didn't really know a single word of Japanese, nonetheless felt that he would write a 600-page book. Why is that? Well, I want to suggest it's because when these people come to touch with differences, they cannot but talk. Okay, I'm going to talk very briefly about something that arose because people were unable in the social sciences to make sense of differences very well, especially East Asia. And this is a thing called area studies. Area studies. And of course, it has long history in some way, like social sciences had precursors. There were always travelers who wrote about land far away. So Marco Polo, who increasingly people now think didn't actually go to China, nonetheless wrote a long book from China by collecting stories from other people who did go there. Colonial governments, of course, wanted knowledge about the colonized. So some of the first social scientific work in Taiwan was done by Japanese colonial bureaucrats and social scientists hired by Japanese colony. Nonetheless, as we know it, area studies arose after 1945. And it arose for a very bad reason in some way. It was part of the Cold War. America wanted to know its friends and enemies. So the major funding for area studies, Title VI, came from the Defense Department. It's the National Defense Security Act. You have to know about the communist countries. China fell. Why is that? Make sure that Africans and Asians don't become communists and so on and on. And over time, it became a huge endeavor. And my favorite statistics is that when the African Studies Association was founded in the US in 1957, I think there were about 20 people. But just 50 years later, there are over 2,000 members. And in the US, in almost every university, you have experts on China and every East Asian society. So area studies have been very successful. But area studies is also very interesting because it didn't do what it was supposed to do. Just briefly, that even though they were supposed to serve the Cold War, most area studies scholars became counter-hegemonic, meaning that they became kind of anti-American in some way, anti-colonial empire. And in some ways, even though they were supposed to be part of social scientific theory called modernization theory, some of the best studies were produced by area studies experts. And in many ways, area studies produced really great works of scholarship and became the main sources against ethnocentrism and Eurocentrism in American university. But what I want to say is that even though it's been very successful in some way, it's actually never been able to tame the ethnocentric impulse in the social sciences. Well, one reason is, of course, area studies seem very parochial. Most people study just China. They spent long years studying Chinese, understanding Chinese history and culture, and so they ended up just writing about China. And for people reading about China, they said, well, that may be true in China, but it has nothing to do with my social theory or sociological theory. Because many of the area studies people were culture-centric, they believed culture was the master key to understanding different societies, China, Germany, wherever, Indonesia. They often ignored inequality and differences. China is not a single entity. And thirdly, and just as importantly, there was no overarching theory. People didn't have a theory about what made things different. And to the extent there were books of theory, they're largely critical or negative. I mean, probably the most read book is Edward Said's book called Orientalism. But it's essentially a critique of what the Orientalists wrote about what we now call the Middle East, the Near East. It's not really an argument about what the Middle East is. And finally, it reproduces many of the same problems. It has horrible time dealing with non-sociological topics like technology and so on. Now, I want to just go briefly and suggest that the trouble with area studies, of course, is on the one hand, it never became a discipline. But even if it did become a discipline, it would have recreated the problems I tried to articulate moments ago for other social sciences. And so what we are left with is a simple thing. Even though area studies provided very good correctives to the social sciences, which provided knowledge about areas that are not part of the West, we are still left with the same problem, that we still don't know from academics, social scientists, what is going on in the world today. We have state-based knowledge for bureaucrats, we have disciplinary knowledge for discipline-bound scholars, but we still don't have a very good idea about what exactly is going on. And as I mentioned, what we don't provide is provided by journalists and popular writers, people who are providing the niche, right? The need for democratic knowledge in democratic society. Right? For democratic society to function, we need knowledge about the world, but we are not getting it. So the whole point of what I'm trying to do is to think about ways in which social theory can be revitalized as a form of global studies, providing what I call knowledge of the present. So it's precisely to integrate some of the strengths of disciplines with area studies to avoid ethnocentrism, which will be the main topic of these lectures, and to provide knowledge of the present for democratic society. Anyway, that's the goal of my book. And what I'll try to do in the book is a number of different things. If you're interested, I can talk more. But for this course, what I would like to focus on is one aspect, namely ethnocentrism and what this has meant for the study of East Asia. I want to close, though, with a final point, which I think was a pragmatist point. Pragmatism is an American philosophy that many people like to make fun of, but it has a very important insight. which is a very simple point, but I think quite true, that most people actually become very good at doing what they have been doing for a long time, but they very often have wrong ideas about what they're doing. So social scientists may have these ideologies of social science, that they are working in a discipline, it's a science, blah, blah, blah. But if they work systematically on a topic for a long time, they begin to realize that you can't just study society. You need to study politics and economics. You need to understand historical background. You need to understand comparative perspectives. And that you cannot be bound by all the structures I mentioned, state-based knowledge, state-based data, and so on. And yet, he or she who knows better by studying may nonetheless believe that they're doing something different. And most importantly, as people study something, they actually become truly committed in some fundamental way to the way things should be, or at least the way things should not be. And again, this in spite of the commandment given by the social sciences that they're supposed to be neutral and objective. So, if I may say so, what I'm trying to do is providing a better story about what people do when they study things systematically over a long time. And that by making people realize what we're really doing is not looking for the endless frontier of disciplining knowledge, but rather what I have repeatedly called knowledge of the present, knowledge that's important for democratic society. I'm not going to talk about these because it's getting late, but I will say one thing. One of the ways in which I'm troubled by journalists and popular writers, even though many of them are very good in some way, is that they can be quite non-democratic in terms of knowledge production. By which I mean a simple thing. The great thing about discipline or science is that it's corrigible, meaning that it's correctable. What's good about discipline is that you are accountable in some way. That people read your paper, review it, peer review, and you cannot simply say what you like, but you are disciplined in that sense by what other experts say. And I think this is very important, because this is part and parcel of what democracy is. What makes democracy completely frustrating is you can't do what you want to do. Because you're an individual, you live with others, and you have to be accountable. And I want to suggest that the trouble with knowledge of the present that non-democratic forms of knowledge producers provide is that they're very often ill-disciplined and undemocratic in that sense. And this is precisely why I find problematic writings by amateurs in the sense of social movement intellectuals. I mean, it's not that they're all bad, obviously. They say really wonderful things. But they are, again, in a very paradoxical way, anti-democratic or undemocratic in their knowledge production, because they don't want to be disciplined by others. They just want to say what they want to say. But I will say one thing, which is that, I'll talk more about this later, if I have time, that one of the point of doing theory is that it's a very difficult word. It's a medieval word, but the purpose of theory in some ways is protractive, meaning that it's in some ways non-empirical and that it's almost a wishful projection. And let me give you a simple example of what I'm trying to get at. If you are a true empiricist, right, and study gender inequality in a very unequal society, all the data will lead you to believe that women and men are fundamentally unequal. You give IQ tests, you give tests of achievement, tests of knowledge, and they will all systematically show that women are not as good. How do you break out of this? Well, I would suggest one of the functional theory, and this is the value-related part, is that you have to write and study things from the standpoint of potential gender equality. It's only against this non-existent possibility that you can make sense of inequality and the things you find. So one of the ways in which, as I mentioned before, the reason it's impossible to read things written about gender inequality 40, 50 years ago is that because people believed in fundamental gender inequality, it just sounds sexist. It's actually people who are utopian almost, people who other people laughed at 40, 50 years ago because they talked about gender equality that we're still able to read in some way. And this is the kind of way in which I want theory to take part. And the global part, I will talk more and more as the course goes on, so I'll skip this as well. So the fundamental point then of the project I want to do is simply to create a form of social theory that will make sense of the ways in which we do social research, that is to create knowledge relevant for democratic society. And that is something that's appropriate for global society, and to reintroduce, as I mentioned, the normative nature of our enterprise. But again, this is my book, and what I'll be doing for the next 6 or 7 lectures is really talking about East Asia, right? And how studying East Asia is a way actually to promote this project of global social theory, because one of the ways in which we can work is precisely by understanding it, we can overcome the Eurocentrism that's deeply afflicted the enterprise of social theory. And from next time, I won't talk as much, and you can talk more. Do you have any questions? Yeah? Should I ask you a question? No.
How do you plan to avoid the institutional problem of institutional arrangement?
Institutional arrangement?
For any state-oriented
Yes.
research.
Yes, it's a problem. It's very difficult. So, what's interesting, I mean, talking about inequality, is that for a long time, sociologists dominated the study of inequality. But just in the last 5 to 10 years, we have been overtaken by economists. Why is that? Well, one reason, of course, is that economists are better at statistics and econometrics. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is economists actually ended up studying quite data. These are the people who are very much in the news today, Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and other people. Piketty's book, Capital for the 21st Century, is kind of a global bestseller now. But what's foundational for his book is actually he did a lot of historical research and found data on inequality, income and wealth. And what's interesting for me is that sociologists should have been doing this. Why didn't they do it? Well, because sociologists were playing the disciplinary game, and they were doing the same thing everyone else was doing, namely cross-national inequality data, mobility data, relying on the same kind of surveys done by American sociologists, and they replicate this in 20 or 30 different countries. And so the kind of knowledge they were producing was knowledge that was good for sociologists doing inequality, but they were not providing any new knowledge about the nature of inequality. All you had to do was actually start digging. In Piketty's case, historical data that were available. and it's just that he began to do it. I mean, similarly, what's really interesting to me is that I have been saying the same thing for a long, long time now about the global nature of inequality. That, you don't have to be a Marxist, I mean, you can be a Bavarian and still believe that the relationship defines inequality. The fact that Apple is an American country means that American inequality cannot be understood without understanding Apple employees working in China or elsewhere. And yet, what's interesting is that even people who study global inequality don't do this. They do it in non-relational way. They simply get statistics on per capita GNP in the US, which is $30,000 or something, and they say, wow, in Africa, in these countries in Africa, they're $100, they're very poor. But there's no theory, there's no much insight. We don't learn anything. And yet I don't know that many people who actually study this. And to the extent people study, they study in this very micro way. So they talk about conflict between, management and employees, as if that's the main point. And I mean, I'm not denying that's an important thing to study, but we lose the larger picture, which is that there are no national companies anymore. Capitalism has become completely global. I mean, we know in theory that sociologists haven't quite fixed that. Yes.
Thank you for your presentations. Really inspiring and exciting to me. And I have a question, maybe a little bit longer, because it's really exciting to know the substance of society or the social theory has increasingly changed. And especially in the globalized world. But at the same time, the localization is simultaneous important trend in the world. So I'm just wondering, on the one hand, there is a trend of, as we mentioned, the unification of different societies, like international society, young national boundary, or the so-called global society, global village, or we always say great Chinese society, including Singapore, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on. But on the other hand, there is another trend, maybe called localization or something, individualization. That means independence of different societies. I mean, in more anthropological sense, different sub-societies inside one nation state. For example, United Kingdom is a nation state, but if we say British society, that must not include Scottish society. And if even the Scottish want to become another society in one nation, or just become another nation state. So I mean, there is a simultaneous trend inside together, unification and independence. And moreover, in terms of cyber society, I mean, the idea of or sense of society has also become more foreign and even have no substantial, like the logic of online society is totally different. No, not totally, rather different from real world society. So I'm just wondering in this context, how the news age society or social theory can respond to such a trend in general, if the past social theory, as you help us to understand,